All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about single relief and dual relief cases. And I want to try and make this easier for you guys to understand. I've looked at a couple videos, stuff on the Samba, and it can be pretty confusing. And I'm going to try and simplify it. You know, all my information may not be 100% correct, but mostly it will be, and it will help you understand this a little bit easier. And then, of course, you should do your own research to find out more about it. But we're going to talk about, this is a dual relief case. The case has a spring and piston that goes in here, and a spring and piston that goes in here. And this is a 40 horse case, which is a single relief case. I also have a 1600 one, or 1500, or 1500, 1600 single relief. So it's got only the one here where it has if you look at yours, it'll have two of these if it's dual relief underneath the engine. So let's talk about why and what they did, why they changed to a dual relief instead of a single relief. And they said it was because of emissions. You know, a lot of places said it was because of emissions. I don't really think so. You know, I don't find Volkswagen to be, other people think Volkswagen's a super honest company. You know, of course they made the TDI scandal, so I don't find them to be always honest. You should always back research everything that they say, because you never know what they're saying just is to protect themselves from something. But I think it was because really what they were running into is they're running into trying to make the engine run a little cooler, and that's why they went to the doghouse cooler, and they wouldn't admit maybe that the other coolers weren't working as well, because then of course that lends them up to lawsuit, right? So they said it was for emissions. Don't agree. But anyway, let's look at this. What the difference is there was an oiling issue, and I have a chart over here. So if you see here on this side of the case, there's the oil pressure relief valve here. It goes through this system here, through this little, you can see right here, that's your oiling, goes through there. And then that pressurizes and puts oil into different parts of the engine, which I can explain to you easier on the chart. I just want to show you on the engine how it works like this. And what they had is on a single relief case, they had one relief valve here. And what the relief valve, as far as I know, works like is when you first start your engine, it allows oil to go through the engine first, and as it gains pressure, the pressure relief valve goes down and allows oil to go to the cooler. So that's the way I understand it. May or may not be right on that one, but the rest of it I know I'm pretty much right on the money. So what happens is the oil galleys or galleries, or however you want to say it, you know, honestly I call them oil galleys. Got some guys say galleries. You look at, you know, those are the guys who read a lot of stuff from the Greenberg. Which, who gives a rip, all right? It's just, we know where the oil goes. It's a gallery, however you want to say it. Galley goes from underneath the engine, comes up, and that's what I guess these guys say, well, it's not a galley because they gather in those areas and then it goes out, whatever. Okay, so the oil pressure goes through the pump, okay? Goes up through that thing, that's the relief valve. That's where it is on the actual engine, where I showed you, and then it goes through this rail here. And then it goes into each part of the engine. And I'm going to show you what the Hoover mod is as well, and the concept of that. It kind of makes sense. But it goes up through here, and then it goes down through the cam bearings, and then goes down to the top end oiling. And you know, through the lifters, of course, to the valve push rods and to the top end. Okay, so what the single relief does is it has a smaller this rail, I'm going to call this the rail, the oil rail here, is smaller than on the dual port. Now on the dual relief case, so it's smaller on the single relief. And what the problem with that is what happens is the pressurization can start to diminish more as you go along further. And the easiest way to understand that is, let's say you're talking about your sprinklers in your yard, And let's say you have a 1 acre yard, okay, and you have a 3/4 inch, main pipe to your house. And to get water pressure to the back of your house, you have to run a larger pipe for the pressure to be the same as it is in the front of the house, okay? So your sprinklers will work back there, the same concept in oil. So if they have a larger main tube going through here, what it does is it evens out the pressure for all the areas that it goes through because there's more supply. All right? That's just an engineering way that they actually do this. So when they did that, they went with a larger oil pump. The earlier ones had a smaller oil pump. And people go, well, what if I just put a larger oil pump on my other one, on my single relief? Well, what's going to happen is it's still not going to get enough to this is a smaller pipe in here. So it's like running a 1/2 inch, main to your back of your property. You're only going to get so much pressure. You can sit there and ramp it up all you want, but it's still, it's going to ramp it up so high here that it could possibly blow the oil cooler up. And that's what the guys are saying, about the oil cooler problems. And that all depends on your RPMs. So if you're not running a lot of RPMs, maybe it's going to be okay. Stuff like that. There's just a lot of engineering things in that. That's why it's better to use a dual relief case. So there's guys that go, yeah, I've got a 2017 or whatever, 2007 or whatever, 2276, and I've got a single relief case. It's really, to me, it's just not a good idea, because what you run into is RPM limits. So for every 1,000 pounds of 1,000 RPMs, you need 10 pounds of oil pressure. So when you're running a bigger engine, it's going to prone to want to rev higher. And when you start revving above the oil pressure supply limit, it's going to be a problem for, parts of your engine, probably somewhere in the center main or the back here, where you're going to have oil deficiency, and it's going to cause problems. Now, when they went to the dual relief, let's talk about that. They made a larger passage through here. The supply is a lot larger. So when the oil came off of each one of these, the sprinklers, okay, they had better, more even pressure. Now, to compensate for that, what they had to do is put a second oil relief valve in the back, because it would ramp up too much pressure, and possibly they were worried about the oil cooler again blowing up. So again, that's the issue that a lot of people are worried about with the single relief case, is the oil pressure being ramped up too high to blow up the oil cooler. But they should be more worried about the potential of oil loss to areas of the engine, because there's not enough supply through the middle of the engine, where I just showed you the side of the engine here. Let's look at that again. I've often wondered about drilling that sucker out, but I don't know. Then you'd have to create a relief valve. That'd be kind of difficult to do, but it is possible. I mean, I don't know how much meat there is in there, but that'd be interesting if somebody came up with something like that. So they put in the second relief valve, and what they call this the oil control valve, and what that does is it keeps the pressure here even. So I've seen guys that say this, let's talk about some of the other oil pressure things that I've seen. I said, Mike, you don't need the high pressure springs on your bigger engine. And I am going to disagree 100%. The reason you have the higher pressure springs is because, remember, every 1,000 RPMs, you need 10 pounds of oil pressure to make that up. So, and there's pressure loss between here. I mean, this oil pump, from what I understand, even a 26 millimeter, is capable of putting out 300 pounds of oil pressure right here. Now, as it goes up through the system, you have oil pressure loss. So over here at this rear front main and through the center main is where you have all this tee off here, right? You're going to have a lot more you're going to have a lot more potential. Now you don't have a way to actually check oil pressure right here, right? So if this is deficient right here or here, more than likely because it's teeing off and doing all this stuff. That's why the some of the guys like the Hoover mod, which actually what it does is you drill through and create a passage between here and here and here and here. You can look up Hoover mod. There's a guy who shows it on YouTube. Does a good job doing that. And I think he's commented on the channel a couple times. But anyway, you could do the Hoover mod here, and it will actually help even out the oil pressure loss from going and oiling the lifters. So, but again, you're trying to out-engineer Volkswagen, you know, for a good reason, because you're trying to get more power out of the engine that they weren't ever expecting it to do. So it's engineered correctly, but you're trying to, you know, do a little bit more to it to make it work better by basically taking these passages here and making them connect to the lifters, which is a smart idea. Okay, what is it? It's not always necessary. It depends on your engine, depends on how much horsepower you're running, depends on, you know, all that stuff. RPMs, remember, RPMs are limited with oil pressure. So what you got here is you have the oil pressure relief valve, because there's so much more supply here and so much more average pressure buildup. They have to relieve it with a second valve over here, and it dumps off back into the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about also the full flow thing in the same video, so that you can understand how that works and how that the reason why some of the guys started opening the cases up years ago. And it became more of a common thing over the years. Some guy said, of course I had to comment that I had my years off, you know, because back in the early days, back in the 80s, early 90s, there wasn't a lot of guys doing this, because again, they were not going for large engines. Large engines was really, really expensive to do. Building up that many RPMs was really expensive to do. And guys, you know, it was very cheap to build an engine over and over versus going ahead and trying to make one last. Okay. So but today that's a totally different story. So a lot of guys would use this type of an oil pump with two lines on it. And this, what this is the pressure side comes out, goes through your filter system and all that, and it comes back in through this very, very small hole. And it makes that real sharp turn and comes out through this one and then goes up through the rest of the engine. Okay, now, remember I was talking about, it's about sprinklers, right? That is a really small hole, right? So it goes through that whole system, and then it comes back and goes through this really small hole, very restricted, okay? And it has to make that sharp turn and go up. There's a pressure loss from doing that. So what the guys figured is to actually open the case right in here and actually have a return with a very large pipe going into the actual oil galley right here. I believe it's right here. Okay, so I have a very large return going in directly into here and blocking off this area right here. Okay, so what that does is it keeps your pressure up higher, so that you have a more efficient and more, I'm trying to think of the word, a better supply of average pressure in your fuel. I'm going to call it your oil rail. I don't know what it's really called. In your oil rail, and keep that at a higher, more average pressure, because there's not as much pressure loss because it's going around this corner and back through that tiny hole. So that became more common. These were kind of the first way to do it. And then became with the opening of the case thing later on. The guys were doing it a long time ago, but it was less common because less guys were doing big engines. And that's why I said that in the earlier videos, that it was less common. It's more common now because you got to think about it. You know, building a 2332 compared to back when I was doing VWs back in the 80s it's almost the same price. You know, it was like about $8,000 to $9,000 back then. Now it's about $8,000 or $9,000, you know, $89,000 when I was 18 was like, you might as well tell me $1 million. There's no chance, you know, I was ever going to come up with that kind of money, you know. So of course the quality of parts then were better. You know, the crankshafts were, you know, like the one you'd have to buy now to keep up with the one you could get back then was $3,000. You know, the one that you can get now, there's one for $3,000, and it's really, really expensive, and it works, and it's really good, really good steel. But we have the Chinese ones, which aren't terribly bad, and they do work. So anyway, but that's kind of how the oil system works. The single relief is lacking this second spring, and it's because there is less a smaller oil hole to go through here, so the supply is not high enough for it to actually ramp up enough at the back end to go through. And plus they had a smaller oil pump. So here's some of the things people have tried on the single relief, is to crank up the oil pressure. If you didn't notice, I had this on the old one that I had that was single relief, and I think I knew it was, but I didn't care. You know, I think when I did it the second time, I did it once and I didn't know. Second time, it was already, the case was already opened up, and I knew it was single relief, and I'd forgotten about it, and I didn't care. You know, it was like, I don't care. You know, it was, we had the conversation. I remember now, I kind of remember talking about it, but I've completely forgot about it. Of you know, how many RPMs are you going to run? You know, again, I was up in the 6s, and that engine should have probably only been in the 5s, and it would have been fine. But of course, that's why there's some wear on some parts, and you know, not to the pistons, but on the cam, I saw a little bit of wear, just a little bit, wasn't much. Still a runnable cam. I'm just going to run it in that used parts engine there, which you guys will see later if you want to come back for that. But anyway, what that happens is there's still, on the single relief case, what guys will try to do, let's say, they say, well, I can get as much oil pressure out of that. You can't, because your supply here is less. And this sprinkler over here is going to have a lot less water going through it, if you know what I mean. If you relate that to sprinklers, it's a lot easier to understand. So this supply, they'll crank this up, and they'll put a bigger oil pump in here. It'll open this thing up a little sooner in the morning, and it'll go right through the cooler, and potentially in the cool weather, you might be over pressurizing your oil cooler, and that's when you could have issues with that thing blowing up in a cold weather place or something like that, when the oils are really thick. With the multi-weights they have now, I don't know if the guys have factored that in. I'm not sure. I mean, you know, maybe running a 1040, you know, then again, you know, you're thinner weight when it's cooler, when it's warmed up, you know, you're kind of trying to play with things that, you know, shouldn't maybe be played with. So your oil loss here is going to be less. So again, the Hoover mod again is like connecting these two to this, and that actually would help out with evening out the pressure on probably either engine. But again, when the supply here is less, it becomes less. And if you open up this supply here, let's say you were to drill that and open it up, I don't know if you can or not. Let's say you did and you got it successfully done. If you still have to add the second relief in, because you would ramp up way too much pressure here, and the same problem would happen, because it would build up too much pressure and build up more pressure in the oil cooler, and potentially, you know, blow that up. This is what I've understood from reading stuff and then trying to remember some of these things. You know, a lot of the stuff I've read is just kind of, you know, it's kind of confusing, and I'm hoping I don't confuse you even more. I hope the way I'm explaining it makes it a little bit easier for you to understand. But it's kind of complicated. It's hard for me to explain, but I'm trying to simplify it and make it as easy as possible for you guys to understand. So anyway, I hope that makes you guys understand the difference between a single relief and dual relief case. That's why a lot of engine, I don't like to say throw away all your single reliefs. They're actually good for 1600. And if you do run a larger oil pump on them, and you know, you are in an area where you're not going to be worried about the oil cooler blowing up because it's very, very cold. I think it's like really cold times, like in the winter, you know, when you're going to possibly have an issue with that thing blowing up. Maybe using a external, instead of using this one, running like say the external MP1 with the fan. That thing's pretty beefy, could handle the pressures maybe more than the stock one, and just winding off the fan and not going with the doghouse, because the engine was not designed for a doghouse. So maybe that would help. You know, it's your baby, so you figure out if you want to do how you want to do it and make it work. But again, you're taking some of the risk, because the single relief, you know, it just doesn't have enough supply here. You're going to lose oil pressure as the engine wears in these areas, probably here, center main, back here, probably not up here, because the longer it has to go, you know, there's resistance in that. You know, as oil goes through here, there's more and more resistance. If you have a larger tube, there's less and less resistance. It goes back to here, and there's less resistance, so there's a better supply for these areas, even though these holes that are here are the same size. Okay, it's this rail that is larger. So anyway, I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Hope it helps you understand your oil system. And I know it's kind of long, but it's kind of a complicated subject. And make sure you comment. It's really important. If you comment anything, like it, I suppose a good video, you know, you missed this, whatever, or that's not how I understand it. That's okay, because what other people can do is they can read those comments and like or dislike them, and actually make it more successful to people who are trying to learn this stuff. I'll talk to you in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.